Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 316. I'm the host Kyle Anzalone. Today joined by co-host Connor Freeman. Connor, how you doing?
Doing great, Kyle. How are you?
Very good. Connor, we got a lot to cover on today's show, so I want to get right into it. Just remind people that it really helps when you share the show. So whether you're finding it where it's hosted at the Libertarian Institute on the blog at antiwar.com, listen on YouTube, Rumble, Odyssey, any of the podcatchers, just try to recommend it to somebody or put it out there on your favorite social media to help us get more people listening to what we're talking about. You can also support the show by donating. We have Patreons, a Star. We accept crypto. And you can support the show by doing your CBD shopping with our sponsor, Paloma Verde. Paloma Verde, CBD.com. Promo code PEACE. I just got off the phone, Connor, with one of the co-owners of Paloma Verde, Connor Ablar. His wife, Vanessa, is the other owner. And he said that more and more people are using our promo code to buy their products. And so, that's great to hear because, of course, it's helping out the show. We get a kickback on every sale. But it also tells me that people must really like their Paloma Verde and they're coming back to it and shopping again. I've only gotten positive feedback, Connor. I know right now my favorite products are really the sports cream because I just like a little localized pain relief. But Connor, you've been trying out that full spectrum product they have. So tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so it's, the tinctures are just, I think they're the best bang for your buck as far as all the great things they have at Paloma Verde. I'm a big fan of the soft gels too, and I've talked about those and the gummies and the doggy treats, but the full spectrum oil is, it lasts very long. It's the strongest stuff, lasts a long time, tastes great. You can put it in tea, coffee, food, whatever you got. And I actually gave some of it to my dad the other day. He was feeling a little sick and had some stomach issues, and I recommended he take some of the full spectrum oil because I thought it might just take care of the nausea, just because there's a little bit of THC in there. I didn't mention that, but I just gave it to him, and he told me he felt better like within an hour. The whole thing just went completely away. Might have been even sooner than that. That's just when I heard back. So I think CBD is just a terrific thing because if you've got pain, inflammation, anxiety, stress, you have difficulty sleeping, insomnia, it's going to help you for all those different things. And we also have, Paloma Verde has some things that also have, like, I believe curcumin and different things like that are just have additional anti-inflammatory qualities. So really there's so many great options there, but I have been enjoying that full spectrum oil quite a bit.
All right, Paloma Verde, CBD.com. Just use the promo code PEACE when you check out. That saves you 20% and it gets the show a kickback. Connor, let's get into it. The first article we have today you wrote for antiwar.com on August 21st, titled Daughter of Putin Ally Killed in Car Blast Outside Moscow. So who is Darya Dugina? Who is Alexander Dugin? What are his ties with Vladimir Putin? And, what all do we know about this attack? Who could possibly be behind it? Why? What implications does it have? I'm just going to let you roll with it and give us all the details we need to know, Connor.
Absolutely. Okay. So on this was last Saturday night, around 9:35 p.m. Local time near Moscow. On a highway. There was a large car bomb explosion that tore apart a Toyota Land Cruiser. The only person inside of the car was the driver, who was, according to emergency services, burned beyond recognition. Her name is Darya Dugina. She's the 30-year-old daughter, or 29-year-old. I've seen both. I believe I'm thinking she's 29. I think I've seen that more now in the latest reporting. So anyway, she's the daughter of Alexander Dugin, the Russian nationalist philosopher who's commonly portrayed in Western corporate press as sort of Putin's brain, the architect of Putin's foreign policies, especially with respect to Ukraine. They've called him the architect of the war in Ukraine. All of this turns out to be nonsense. But nevertheless, that is this guy's rep, at least in, as I said, the corporate press, Western propaganda. Now, associates of Dugin believed that he was the intended target. So essentially what happened was there was this family festival where Dugina and her father attended Saturday evening outside of Moscow. He gave a lecture there on tradition and history. She's a political scientist and a journalist, by the way. He's, also a they're both political commentators. And they are big supporters of Russia's war in Ukraine. Of course, though they don't think they are critics of Putin, and they don't believe he is they don't believe he's strong enough, and they think that his policies have been naive, and with respect to him trying to essentially, they think his policy with respect to the West is too weak, and that it was naive, for instance, to try and implement the Minsk II Accords and things like this. So after the lecture and after the event at this festival, she left in his car. So apparently there was sort of a last minute decision where he decided to take another vehicle. And a bomb evidently was planted underneath the car, the SUV, near the driver's side. And so 5 minutes after she left this event, her car, the bomb detonated. The car was engulfed in flames. She crashed into a fence. And as I said, was burned beyond recognition. Early reports suggested that a homemade explosive could have been used. There was footage coming out, on social media showing Alexander Dugin on the highway, looking on at the fiery wreckage, just holding his head in his hands and just visibly shaken by the whole thing, of course. Okay, so shortly after this, in my first report for antiwar.com, I point out that Russia's investigative committee, the country's equivalent of the FBI, released a statement which said, given the data already obtained, the investigation believes that the crime was pre-planned and a murder for hire. You had friends and associates of Dugin again suggesting that actually maybe even Dugin and his daughter had been targeted. And importantly, I think, TASS reported that there was a regardless, because there just hasn't been enough evidence. I'll get to who the Russians have accused so far here in just a second, but it's important to know that evidently there was no real security at this event, and that at the entrance of the parking lot where Dugin's car his SUV was parked, there was no protocols taken, no precautions. So it would have left ample opportunity for anybody who wanted to do this to get away with it, to, inconspicuously, or just get away with planning a bomb or whatever and getting the heck out of there. Now, Sergei Makov, who's an analyst and a former Putin advisor, pretty quickly said Dugin was likely the intended target, adding it's completely obvious the most probable suspects are the Ukrainian military intelligence and the Ukrainian security service. Kiev denied responsibility shortly after this incident and the murder, and said, quote, "This is Mikhailo Podolyak, an advisor to Vladimir Zelensky, the president of Ukraine." So Podolyak said, "We are not a criminal state unlike Russia, and definitely not a terrorist state." And the Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova, she didn't attribute blame to Ukraine immediately, and said in a statement that if the Ukraine trace is confirmed, then we're talking about this policy of state terrorism implemented by the Kiev regime. Importantly, Dugina was, again, as I said, a political commentator who had been placed under American and British sanctions, actually, for allegedly spreading, quote, disinformation regarding Ukraine. She was the chief editor of some journalism outlets and a TV channel called Saragard, and then chief editor of an outlet called United World International. And of course, if you read the mainstream press, I did hear from Mark Sloboda, who's based in Moscow and an Russia expert and a foreign policy analyst I like quite a bit. But I heard him on Max Blumenthal's show on the Gray Zone recently saying the Sargard is, I believe he said, run by a conservative oligarch, Orthodox oligarch, and that it is quite nationalist. So that's fine. But I'm just saying what's a little bit revolting is when you read the Washington Post, for instance, the day after this, less than a day after she was burned alive, they're just calling everything she does is just disinformation and almost unpersoning her before the fire in the car has even been put out. So I found that pretty gross. So I just added here that, though they did that and try to belittle her and delegitimize her by saying everything she does is disinformation, it's important to know that, of course, the Post is owned by Jeff Bezos, who's a CIA contractor with a $600 million cloud computing services contract with the intelligence agency. And that importantly, when Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was killed in a special forces raid, the Islamic State leader in Syria, the Post infamously blared in a headline that an austere religious scholar had just been killed. And I just point out that the rise of ISIS in Syria was a direct result of the CIA's dirty war against Assad. Now, Dugin is known, as I said, for his anti-West and neo-Eurasian viewpoint, and he has been hit with sanctions as well by the Americans. He's often described by some in the West as having this massive influence over Putin. For instance, CBS called him the far-right theorist behind Putin's plan, but in 2017, the Rand Corporation said, despite the accusations, Dugin is perhaps best thought of as an extremist provocateur with some limited peripheral impact than as an influential analyst with a direct impact on policy. He does not appear to have direct involvement with the major political parties. He was also removed from his position at Moscow State University after calling for the killing of Ukrainian nationalists, and he has offered significant criticism of Putin's policies in Ukraine. And he was kicked out of that post at the university at the behest of the Kremlin. And then I point out here that it's not unreasonable to suggest that Kiev would have played a role here, citing one of your articles, Kyle, from the Libertarian Institute from back in June, where you were talking about a report in the Times, I believe it was the Times of London, saying that, well, quoting unnamed Ukrainian intelligence officers and a couple of sergeants from an elite special forces unit called the Shaman Battalion, taking credit for sabotage attacks involving explosives behind quote behind enemy lines beyond the Russian border. And they were quite proud of it. And one of them says, quote, "The Russians don't know what happened. They often can't believe we were there. The most interesting missions are working behind enemy lines, planting explosives behind the front lines beyond the border." All right. Now, the following, this was Monday. I put out a piece for antiwar.com called "Moscow Accuses Kiev Special Services in Russian Journalist Car Bombing." And this is, so on Monday, the Russian FSB accused essentially the Azov Battalion and Ukrainian intelligence of carrying out this murder. They've identified a suspect. Her name is Natalia Vovik. She's a 43-year-old Ukrainian national. Supposedly, there was an open source intelligence docs of members of the Azov Battalion on the Russian internet back in April, and that she was identified as one of these people, although I believe her last name was different at the time, which would have been, you know what? Actually, I'm blanking on what the other last name was. But apparently, her daughter, when she entered the country here in late July in Russia, according to the Russian accusations, in order to carry out these the surveillance on Dugina that helped her with this if she did commit this murder. Apparently, her daughter used the original name. And regardless, if any of these accusations from the Russian intelligence services are accurate, it represents a major failure on their part. But again, they don't have sufficient evidence to prove that she did this. However, I'll just lay out some of the things. Basically, what they're saying is that this woman named Natalia Vovik entered Russia from Ukraine in July, on July 23rd, and that she moved in with her daughter into an apartment building in a housing block where Darya Dugina lived, and carried out comprehensive surveillance and spying on her for almost a month, following her around with a Mini Cooper that she was changing the license plates on in order to avoid detection. They argued that they were saying that she changed her hair and all kinds of things as well, her hair color, excuse me, and basically spied on her. And then actually they're saying that she went with her daughter to the family festival we discussed a moment ago, where Dugin gave his lecture and where Dugina was present. And they're suggesting that she carried out the controlled explosion remotely while Dugina was driving on the highway, and then Vovik fled to Estonia with her daughter on Sunday, according to the FSB. And they describe how she, it said the FSB said that, quote, "Vovik used a car license plate from the Donetsk People's Republic when entering Russia, replaced it with a Kazakhstan license plate when driving in Moscow, and a Ukrainian plate when crossing into Estonia." And they published video footage that shows Vovik entering Russia, going inside an apartment building where Dugina lived, and hastily exiting the country. It also shows, of course, the various license plates on the same car Vovik appears to be driving. And now, of course, TASS reported that the Russians were seeking extradition of Vovik from Estonia, but Lisa Toots, the Estonian Foreign Ministry spokesman, said it's not appropriate to discuss whether or not she. This was on Monday, by the way. I've heard that apparently she fled to Austria, and then her whereabouts are unknown at this point. Last I heard, but This was on Monday. So Lisa Toots, again, the foreign ministry spokeswoman in Estonia, said it's not appropriate to discuss whether or not she's in the country or if she entered by way of Russia anyway, adding that they only share information on individuals entering and leaving their country, quote, only in cases prescribed by law, and that FSB accusations and propaganda do not meet the criteria. And so Estonia's Police and Border Guard Service added that they hadn't received yet an official request from Russia at the time. Podolyak then, again, this advisor to Zelensky, said the FSB allegations are Russian propaganda and fiction, and then suggested that it was a Russian false flag all along, and denied that they would have orchestrated the killing anyway because Dugin is a marginal figure. Putin sent his condolences to Dugina's family, saying it was a despicable, cruel crime, and that she was a bright and talented person with a real Russian heart, kind, loving, sympathetic, and open, a journalist, scientist, philosopher, war correspondent. She served the people, the fatherland. She proved by deed what it means to be a patriot of Russia. And I added a note at the end here that according to Al Jazeera, during an appearance on Russian television the week before she was killed, Dugina had dubbed the United States a zombie society where people oppose Russia but cannot locate it on a map, which I think is actually pretty accurate. Now, the only other thing I'll say is that, despite all this propaganda about, Putin and Dugin having this incredible relationship, he's Putin's Rasputin and all this nonsense, they've apparently never met. And she never met Putin. The first time Putin has mentioned either of their names was earlier this week when he sent condolences to the family. There's some other stuff that's going around, speculation that this could have been an attack by the Russian mob, or this could have been some sort of an internal factional battle within Russian intelligence that happened, or that Russia's trying to intimidate dissidents. Again, there's not enough evidence to suggest if any of these things are all true. Regardless, Zelensky was being an opportunist and suggested that, oh boy, the Russians are going to do something really nasty now. Maybe, I don't know, but the thing is that Ukraine and Kiev were escalating the war in Ukraine. Of course, Ukraine is celebrating its independence this week, and from the Soviet Union, its anniversary. And of course, NATO is talking about how they're going to be supporting Ukraine in its war and providing them with all this heavy weaponry for years going forward. We previously heard high up Pentagon officials talking about supporting them for much longer than that, even like in terms of the decades. And so, of course, this constant attacks going on in Crimea now, sabotage attacks we have Ukrainian officials taking credit for in the media. They're unnamed, of course, but, these sabotage attacks on the airfields and the ammunition depots and naval bases and things like this. And, of course, we know that if they attack Crimea, that's Russian territory. Dmitry Medvedev, the former president, has warned that there will be a doomsday for the Ukrainian leadership if they go ahead and do that. So all that was leading up to this attack that happened last Saturday. And so, yeah, if this is Ukraine, if they were responsible for it, even if it wasn't this woman, if it was her working with some, other, I don't know, an assassination team that's located inside Russia that's sympathetic to the Ukrainian cause or to her cause or to Azov's cause or whatever, then it, of course, would be a major escalation in the war to carry out a targeted assassination like this. What's most disturbing, I should say, about all this is that there just doesn't seem to be any sympathy for this woman or concern about what murdering her represents right now in the context of this war, what it means for free speech, what it means for journalism, what it means for our morality, and the way that the mainstream media out here basically wants us to feel horrible or cheer on the FBI when they basically ensnare somebody in a plot to kill John Bolton and threaten them with charges of 25 that could see up to 25 years in prison over $100 in a cryptocurrency transaction for discussing killing John Bolton or something like this, or when we saw what happened to the man who FBI informants essentially bribed him and led him along all in this sort of plot they're describing as an attempt to murder George W. Bush or to assassinate him. And now, of course, that guy is facing, heavy sentences and things like this. It's just we're supposed to feel bad when it's one of our war criminals who is never really facing any danger. But when a journalist is set on fire, or in the case of somebody like Assange, and their whole life is taken away, their whole freedom is taken away, banished to the worst dungeons of the empire over journalistic endeavors and just exercising free speech and speaking truth to the power and to the people. We just act, as a culture, like that doesn't matter. And it's really been disgusting to see the mainstream press just literally unperson somebody in such a way. But again, I'm not taking a position on what I think actually happened because I just don't see enough evidence yet. But regardless, it's just a very ugly situation, and we could see escalations on either side as a result of this.
All right, Connor, thank you so much for that breakdown. And as always, to balance, just talking about what's a rumor and then to dismiss some of the ridiculous stuff and actually talk about the facts that are known and set what the mainstream media has misled us about straight. So next up, let's talk about the Iran nuclear deal, the progress there. There's a lot happening, Connor, and some of it points to strong possibilities of returning to the deal, but then there's also other issues. And so I'll let you go ahead and break down like strictly the Iran deal thoughts, and then I'll talk some Saudi Arabia and some Syria.
Cool. All right. So Israel's this is from August 18th. I got a bunch of articles here from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. We got so this is Lapide. This is Yair Lapide, the prime minister the new Israeli prime minister, telling the U.S. not walking away from the Iran deal talks right now shows weakness. And you will see a running theme here, as you can predict, that if you don't do everything Tel Aviv demands of us, then it's just weakness. Last Thursday, Yair Lapide held a meeting with U.S. officials to discuss the Iran deal and express Tel Aviv's opposition to the U.S. potentially returning to the JCPOA. He said it shows weakness not to walk away right now. Quote, in the current situation, the time has come to walk away from the table. Anything else sends a message of weakness to Iran. Lapide told U.S. Ambassador to Israel Tom Nides and Representative Ted Duth, a Democrat from Florida, according to an Israeli official speaking to Axios. And this came as Washington was still reviewing Iran's response to the EU proposal for the final deal that the EU foreign policy chief Joseph Borrell had put forward. Lapide told officials that now is the time to sit and talk about what to do going forward in order to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. The Israeli official said the EU proposal contains U.S. concessions to Iran, though this was denied by the National Security Council. White House National Security Council spokesperson Adrian Watson said that the reports, quote, that we have accepted or are considering new concessions to Iran as part of re-entering the 2015 nuclear deal are categorically false. Domestic political opposition to the deal is growing, though, and becoming more organized again amid reports of an agreement becoming a possibility. A group of hawkish former American officials, including John Bolton, discussed military alternatives to the JCPOA in Washington. Bolton and other former officials were joined by members of the National Council Resistance of Iran, which is led by the Mujahideen cult, a controversial group of exiled Iranians that are considered to be a cult. The MEK have carried out assassinations inside Iran, working with Tel Aviv, of course, notoriously during the Obama administration, and also Mohsen Fakhrizadeh was likely killed in an MEK attack, and as the latest one one of the most high-profile assassinations in the last couple of months that Israel has carried out in Iran was of the Colonel Hassan Sayed Kodeh in his driveway, and just the hallmarks of it, a couple people on motorcycles who shot this guy to death in his car. This bears some of the hallmarks of previous attacks by the MEK and assassinations inside Iran. So, all right, so we have another one. Report details of a new Iran nuclear deal approved by Iran. So this was earlier on. This is as the U.S. continued to study the response. The Cradle put out a report detailing some of the specifics from Tehran's response and guarantees that Iranians were seeking in case the deal is killed again down the line. So this was the Iranian response to the EU proposal. Now, the report cited an unnamed Iranian source who said the deal includes comprehensive sanctions relief for Iran, as well as a series of measures meant to deter Washington from withdrawing from the agreement in the future. And the source points out contingencies Iran wanted regarding the advanced centrifuges that need to be shut down in order for them to return to full compliance with the JCPOA. Tehran put forward the idea of leaving the centrifuges in such a state that they could be brought back online within a year if the Americans pull out again and the deal goes south. Quote, the platforms of the centrifuges will not be destroyed and their connections and electricity are collected, which brings our rebuildability to under 1 year and is kind of a guarantee, the source said. So we discussed before that they had some things, and I think back in March I read in the Middle East Eye that there were agreements, or at least that they were working on earlier stages of the indirect talks in Vienna, that I think 3 of the advanced centrifuges would be disconnected, not removed, so that they could turn them back on in this kind of a situation down the line so they have an insurance policy. And as Dave writes here in this report, the source said that altogether there are 21 guarantees written into the deal to alleviate Iran's concerns about the U.S. withdrawing from the agreement. Under one guarantee, if the U.S. leaves the deal, there will be a 3-year and 1-month grace period during which foreign companies will be unaffected by sanctions. It's not clear if any guarantees that are reliant on U.S. action would be enforceable on a future administration. Since the JCPOA is not a treaty, the next administration will not be bound by the agreement, and that issue has been a significant factor in the talks between the U.S. and Iran. According to the Cradle report, the ball is once again in Washington's court. If the U.S. approves the deal, its implementation will take place in stages. The first step would be the signing of the agreement in Vienna. Then the U.S. would cancel 3 executive orders signed by President Trump that withdrew the U.S. from the JCPOA. Iran would then have 60 days to test the sanctions relief by selling oil to Western countries and accessing Iranian funds that have been frozen overseas. Sanctions against the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, will remain in place, although some will be eased by allowing Western business with Iranian companies that make transactions with the IRGC. Israel torpedoed that provision, by the way. Tehran did not verify the details of this report. However, one of Iran's main sticking points to the date has been these concerns about the U.S., just killing the deal. After it's been signed and implemented, either during the Biden administration or whatever comes next. And I'll get to that here in a moment, how the Israelis influence the American response. But U.S. tries to reassure Israel on potential Iran deal, says agreement not imminent. And this is from Dave again on August 22nd. So highlighting the pressure applied by Tel Aviv on Washington regarding these JCPOA negotiations recently, U.S. officials told Axios that they have been seeking to reassure Tel Aviv that Biden's administration is not making concessions to Tehran and a deal is not imminent. Quote, a deal might be closer than it was 2 weeks ago, but the outcome remains uncertain as some gaps remain. In any case, it doesn't seem to be imminent. A U.S. official said of what the Biden administration has been telling Israel. Israeli officials confirmed these talks, but said their concerns have not been eased. We are not reassured. We are very concerned, an Israeli official said. Jake Sullivan's Israeli counterpart, and I think this meeting ended up being quite important, Eyal Hulada headed to Washington for talks with Sullivan on the deal that were supposed to take place this Thursday. At the same time, Israeli Defense Minister Benny Gantz said Tel Aviv will work to bring a potential deal down. We have another one. U.S. official says nuclear deal closer after Iran made concessions. And this is from Dave DeCamp again on August 23rd. On Monday, an anonymous American official told Reuters that Iran had made some major concessions that brought both sides significantly closer to a deal than before. The official said Iran dropped its demands regarding both the IRGC FTO blacklist issue as well as the IAEA probe into the traces of the unprocessed uranium particles found at the undeclared sites. Quote, Iran came back last week and basically dropped the main hangups to a deal, the official said. We think we have finally crossed the Rubicon and moved toward the possibility of getting back into the deal under terms that Biden can accept. If we are closer today, it's because Iran has moved. They conceded on issues that they've been holding on to from the beginning. And of course, that's not true. Tehran dropped the demand regarding the IRGC FTO delisting back in June. But this is, importantly, a quasi-official acknowledgement of that on Washington's part. So I think we can finally stop debunking some of these claims and misconceptions in the media. Middle East Eye reported on further details. Quote, Iran wants guarantees that the IAEA would close all of them. We said we would never accept that, the official said. A second official said that, meaning these IAEA probes and everything. So, quote, a second official said that under full implementation of the deal, the IAEA would be able to resume a comprehensive inspections regime that could detect any Iranian effort to pursue a nuclear weapon covertly. Iran has also demanded that the United States guarantee that no future U.S. president would abandon the deal, but the Biden administration made clear that it cannot provide such ironclad assurances. In addition, the officials said Iran would not be permitted to have any of the 20% and 60% enriched uranium that it is stockpiling today, and advanced centrifuges Iran is operating would be stopped and removed, including all of the centrifuges at its fortified underground facility at Fordow. So again, I don't think that insurance policy is going to work. Basically, what keeps happening is you'll see as Iran is making all these concessions, they have certain guarantees they're seeking, and then Israel talks to the Americans, and the Americans, largely influenced by Israel, but I think this is also just basically the policy, just keep denying every single one of these attempts at getting a guarantee or some kind of an insurance policy. Or quite a few of them anyway. We'll have to see what they ultimately come to as a compromise. But EU Foreign Policy Chief Joseph Borrell, who put forward the final proposal both sides are negotiating, said Tehran's response was reasonable and said most JCPOA signatory states agree with the proposal, adding he still hadn't received the American response at the time. And I think we can infer here that essentially everybody agrees at this point, with the exception of the Americans, because he did. That's really the only discrepancy he mentioned. So, quote, there was a proposal from me as coordinator of the negotiations saying this is the equilibrium we reached, and I don't think we can improve it on one side or the other. And there was a response from Iran that I considered reasonable, Borrell told a university event in Spain. Earlier on Monday, Iran's foreign ministry spokesman Nasser Kanani accused Washington of procrastinating in the negotiations. Quote, America and Europe need an agreement more than Iran, Kanani told a news conference. On Sunday, a call was held with President Joe Biden, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, French President Emmanuel Macron, and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, where they reportedly discussed the JCPOA among other matters. Quote, in addition, they discussed ongoing negotiations over Iran's nuclear program, the need to strengthen support for partners in the Middle East region, and joint efforts to deter and constrain Iran's destabilizing regional activities, the White House said in its description of the call. We now have some clearer pictures as to what a post-signed deal situation would look like. As Al Jazeera reports, according to sources with knowledge of the EU's proposal, it stipulates that on the day after a new agreement is signed, sanctions on 17 Iranian banks as well as 150 economic institutions will be lifted. It also says Tehran will immediately begin to reverse the steps it took to advance its nuclear technology, which is now beyond the scope of what the UN nuclear watchdog, the IAEA, and the deal's original signatories say is acceptable. Iran's stockpile of enriched uranium is now at 60% enrichment, its highest ever, and a jump from the 3.67% limit set out by the deal, formerly called the JCPOA. Enrichment at 90% is needed to build a nuclear bomb. Within 120 days of signing the agreement, Iran will be permitted to export 50 million barrels of oil per day. The deal also includes the release of $7 billion of Iranian funds, which are currently held in South Korea, the sources said, speaking on condition of anonymity. The U.S. will have to pay a fine in the event it withdraws from the nuclear agreement again, as it did under the administration of Trump in 2018, according to the sources. And then we have Benny Gantz heading to the U.S. and says Israel will do everything it can to stop the Iran deal. So Gantz announced he is headed to Washington for talks this week with the head of CENTCOM and Jake Sullivan. He said Tel Aviv will do everything it can. Gantz usually makes some extra stops, so I said at least with the head of CENTCOM and Sullivan. I believe the meeting with Sullivan is today, and he spoke with the head of CENTCOM yesterday in Florida. Now, he said Tel Aviv will do everything it can to stop the U.S. from returning to the deal. Quote, the state of Israel is not opposed to agreements in general, but it is opposed to the emerging nuclear agreement, he said. Today, Gantz, this was yesterday, but Gantz was meeting with Michael Eric Kurilla in Florida, and then I think he's speaking with Sullivan today. Quote, we are in contact with international authorities, the Americans and others regarding our opposition to the agreement, Gantz said. We'll do everything we can to exert influence on this matter. According to a White House readout of the meeting between Sullivan and Hulata on Tuesday, the two officials discussed threats posed by Iran. The White House said Sullivan reaffirmed America's commitment, quote, to preserve and strengthen Israel's capability to deter its enemies and to defend itself against any threat or combination of threats, including from Iran and Iranian-backed proxies, and our commitment to ensure Iran never acquires a nuclear weapon. Okay, so now Iran receives America's response to the EU proposal to revive the nuclear deal. And this is from Dave DeCamp on August 24th at antiwar.com. So on Wednesday, Iran said it did receive America's response to the EU proposal, and they're now conducting their own, quote, careful review of Washington's response before they move forward. Quote, this evening, Iran received the U.S. response through the European Union. The careful review of the response has started in Tehran, said Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman Nasser Kanani. He added Iran will share its view with the EU as the coordinator of the nuclear talks upon completion of Tehran's review. The Biden administration confirmed the news with Ned Price, the State Department spokesperson, saying, we received Iran's comments on the EU's proposed final text through the EU. Our review of those comments is now concluded. We have responded to the EU today. Now, again, the organized political opposition to the deal in the U.S. Congress is growing among both Democrats and Republicans. Over a dozen House Democrats on Wednesday held a press conference to issue concerns over the ongoing talks with Iran. Now, as Middle East Eye reports, Elaine Luria, who's a huge China hawk and Iran hawk, House rep in Virginia. She's big in favor of this, the Republicans' proposed sort of Taiwan Invasion Prevention Act, and this would just completely evaporate Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, hand over Biden or whoever is the next president is war powers to launch a war against China in the event that they attack Taiwan without getting congressional authorization or, God forbid, a declaration of war. Now, and she did all of this back in April. We did a show about this back then. And she actually said verbatim some of these same things. But she goes, as a group, we have a variety of concerns everywhere from concern about the negotiations all the way to the spectrum of outright opposition to reentering the deal, Virginia Congresswoman Elaine Luria said. We understand that while the recent negotiations have not concluded, we feel we can't stay quiet about the unacceptable and deeply troubling turn that these talks have reportedly taken. 5 members who attended the Wednesday press conference said they were not altogether opposed to negotiating with Iran, but they have called for a longer and stronger deal than the original 2015 agreement and expressed concerns about potentially delisting Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard. Congressman Dean Phillips said, I believe deeply in diplomacy, but diplomacy has to be built on a foundation of potential force. And that's what this is all about. Iran must know the consequences of their inaction, of their inability or unwillingness to abide by any potential agreement. So this guy's really paying attention to everything that's going on, obviously. And around 15 House Republicans on the House Foreign Affairs Committee also held a news conference on Wednesday. However, rather than just raising concerns, they were opposed to the deal and called for continuing the Trump maximum pressure campaign. Congressman Michael McCall said Republicans are drafting a measure to bring the House to the House floor legislation that would force any new agreement to be subject to a congressional review. He predicted a lot of Democrats are with us. Now, that I agree with. I think he's probably right on this issue. And he said Republicans would seek to force a floor vote on a measure of disapproving of the New Deal. Now, it's unclear, however, whether all of the Democrats at the press conference would vote against the deal. Even if opponents to the nuclear deal gain a majority, and even in the case that they gain a majority in the House, these nuclear deal opponents, it is unlikely, according to the Middle East Eye here, they say it's unlikely that they'd be able to muster 60 votes that they would need to block the deal in the Senate, though. Okay, so now we have your Lapide. Israel's Lapide urges U.S. to scrap Iran nuclear deal talks. This is again from the 24th, and this is from Dave DeCamp. He says on Wednesday, as Tehran and Washington appear closer to inking a deal, Lapide again demanded the U.S. and the EU cut off their negotiations with Iran. Lapide said lifting sanctions will give the Islamic Republic $100 billion that will be used to undermine stability in the Middle East and spread terror around the globe. He also claimed the JCPOA would not prevent Iran from building a nuclear weapon, even though the JCPOA sets strict limits on Iran's nuclear program. In our eyes, it does not meet the standards set by President Biden himself, preventing Iran from becoming a nuclear state. So this is all just transparent propaganda. But I do notice that the Israelis are saying more and more often that they go, well, Biden said, this isn't Biden's deal. Like, he is not meeting his standards. They're speaking for him. And this is largely because Biden's pathetic trip to the Middle East included him going to Jerusalem and putting out this joint declaration where he goes, I'll never allow Iran to become a nuclear state or gain a nuclear weapon, use all my national power, and said a bunch of other hawkish rhetoric looking for political points in the Middle East and to help them build this NATO-style alliance, which appears to be failing, thankfully, to a large degree. So the only other report I want to add is up at antiwar.com today. Again, from Dave, he covered this Axios report about Israeli officials saying that the U.S. has toughened its stance in response to the Iran deal proposal. So basically what they're saying here is you're getting more details about the meeting that Eyal Hulata had with Jake Sullivan and evidently as well Brett McGurk, the top Middle East official on the NSC under Biden. And he says that basically the U.S. officials briefed Hulada on their planned response to Iran and the EU before it was submitted. When Hulada arrived in Washington, the Israeli government was worried that the U.S. would soften its stance on Iran, but by the time he left, these concerns were evidently eased. The report said the U.S. has refused two key Iranian demands. One was easing of sanctions on companies that do business with the IRGC, which is designated by the U.S. as a terrorist organization. Iran had earlier dropped its demand, of course, to have the designation on the FTO list dropped. But what they were looking for was, as we discussed, Tehran wanted it basically there to be some sort of a waiver or sanctions eased for Iranian companies that do conduct business with the IRGC, which again is a part of the Iranian military, so that they could still work with some international firms. And Israel said no, and now the United States has said no. Although it's not clear to me that the U.S. would have accepted that anyway, but nevertheless, the Israelis feel that they succeeded here. And then the other demand was concerning investigations into traces of uranium at the undeclared sites that we've talked about from the IAEA probe. Tehran wanted that to be dropped before, as a part of. It wasn't really clear if that. I don't think that would have been a part of the JCPOA. It seemed like that was a side deal, but the U.S. said that they won't accept that earlier, and apparently this was influenced by Israel as well. The third issue was over a guarantee that Iran wants. And Israel and the Americans love using that issue to thwart diplomacy. It's times like this, actually, as we've pointed out. So now the third issue was over this guarantee that Iran wants if the U.S. withdraws from the deal again. Now, Tehran wanted, apparently, now we heard earlier it was like it was slightly more than a 3-year grace period, but it says here in this report from Axios that Tehran wanted a 2.5-year grace period, so that if the U.S. leaves the deal and reimposes sanctions, Western companies international companies that have done business with Iran would not be affected for that amount of time. The Israeli officials said that this would only be possible so long as Iran remains compliant with the deal during that time, which is interesting, again, because Iran is still in compliance with the deal. The U.S. illegally and unilaterally left the deal and reimposed sanctions. Under Articles 26 and 36 of the JCPOA, Iran is still well within its rights to expand its nuclear program and do these other things it's doing for leverage, because the U.S. and Europe have completely abrogated their responsibilities and obligations under the deal. So Israel is still technically in compliance. They're just not following it to the letter, and they've expanded their program obviously beyond the limits of the deal. Yair Lapide on Thursday said Tel Aviv's pressure worked and influenced the U.S. response on the EU proposal, or to the EU proposal. He said, quote, "The Americans accepted a large part of the things that we wanted them to include in the drafts." And so basically, if the Israelis are pleased with what America is saying now to Iran and the EU, that doesn't bode well for future the negotiation process going forward. Because if Israel likes the deal that the response the Americans are giving Iran probably won't, and this could either cause some more deadlock. But Iran has been showing that they're willing to make a lot of more concessions, but this could cause more deadlock. And as well, we're going to get into this, but the U.S. and Israel are starting to bomb Syria. They've been bombing Syria for much of this whole week, so tensions are rising again.
All right, Connor, thank you for doing that report. I just have one more story to add on Iran, and that is, look, it's, a lot of things are going on here, as you mentioned, and that the environment isn't all positive, but certainly we are a lot closer to getting a deal done now than we were several months ago. And so with the improved environment, we are seeing talks between Iran and other regional states. And so I wrote this article for the Libertarian Institute on August 23rd. As starts to say the Iran nuclear agreement progressed, Tehran has taken a flurry of steps to improve its relationship with several Gulf Arab states. Iran has already reestablished diplomatic ties with the UAE and Kuwait. Next, Tehran seeks to engage with Riyadh. In recent months, European Union diplomats have made a final push to get the U.S. and Iran to return to compliance with the 2015 nuclear agreement, or Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA. On Monday, Reuters reported Iran had dropped two critical demands, saying the nuclear deal is now close. As talks progressed in recent weeks, Kuwait announced that it appointed its first ambassador to Iran since 2016. Kuwait and the UAE cut ties with Iran 6 years ago in solidarity with Riyadh. Abu Dhabi has quietly taken steps to reestablish a normal diplomatic relationship with Tehran. The improved atmosphere in the Gulf has created a more optimistic outlook in Tehran. Iran's foreign ministry spokesperson Nassar Kanani said on Monday that the regional climate is strengthening optimism over resuming diplomatic relations with Saudi Arabia. In addition to diplomatic engagement, Riyadh and Tehran could undertake joint economic projects. Iran began operations in a shared oil field with Saudi Arabia. However, oilprice.com reports Iran is currently taking the project alone because of U.S. sanctions. Return to compliance with the JCPOA would see sanctions lifted in Iran, able to cooperate with other states in its development of projects. Next up is U.S. bombs the current conflict going on in Syria. Connor, over the past 3 days, we've had a pretty major escalation in the conflict in Syria that started off with this article, or I'll break it down, this article that I have from the Libertarian Institute on August 23rd, titled "The U.S. Carries Out Airstrikes Targeting Iran-Backed Groups in Syria." U.S. CENTCOM, Central Command, announced it carried out airstrikes in Syria on Tuesday. The Department of Defense claims the bombs hit facilities used by groups affiliated with Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, and they were in retaliation for an attack on U.S. personnel in Syria. The CENTCOM press release asserts that Iranian-supported groups attacked U.S. forces in Syria on August 15th, and Tuesday's bombing was necessary to protect U.S. troops. The statement said, "Today's strikes were necessary to protect and defend U.S. personnel. The U.S. took proportionate, deliberate action to limit the risk of escalation and minimize the risk of casualties." The Pentagon statement on August 15th said the U.S. base in Al-Tan, Syria was attacked by a series of drones, causing no damages or injuries. There was not a claim of responsibility for the attack. The White House has not provided evidence that an Iranian-backed group carried out the attack. The U.S. occupies about a third of Syrian territory with 900 troops. Washington claims its forces remain in Syria to ensure the enduring defeat of the Islamic State. However, Iranian-backed groups support the government of Bashar al-Assad, an avowed enemy of the Islamic State. In recent months, ISIS has carried out several attacks against Assad's forces, killing scores of soldiers. And so, Connor, I think this is really important because in the press release even, it says that the U.S. mission in Syria isn't to deter Iran, isn't to steal the oil, it's to ensure the lasting defeat of the Islamic State. And look, if you want to ensure the lasting defeat of the Islamic State, you have to, you can't take out the Assad government. You can't take out Assad's allies because, they are the groups that largely defeated the Islamic State throughout most of Syria. So President Joe Biden has asserted that he had the constitutional authority to carry out the strikes under Article 2 of the Constitution. And while, there may be some argument that, hey, if U.S. troops come under fire, the president has the authority to back them. The problem is that the U.S. troops are illegally occupying Syria in the first place and should never be there. And so we should just come home. The strikes also came as Washington and Tehran have made significant progress towards talks reviving the nuclear agreement. Connor, I did see that Haaretz had quoted a U.S. official saying, well, these two issues are separate. And I can see Washington believing that, but I can't imagine Iran feeling that way. And so you almost have to wonder if there is maybe a deliberate effort within the U.S. somewhere to undermine the talks by carrying out these actions. Now, again, this is in response for an attack that killed no one and injured no one. And Iran has come out and said they weren't our groups that the U.S. is bombing. So in a way, this is good if it is maybe an Iranian-backed group. Maybe Iran is trying to send a signal that, hey, we're not going to let this impact towards Syria as a separate issue. We just want to get back into the nuclear deal and get the sanctions relief. At the same time, it could really be Iran saying like, hey, we don't know these folks and you're basically just killing the Syrian army at this point, which again is the group directly opposed to the Islamic State. Now, Connor, these attacks have continued for 2 days, and On the second day of attacks, we have a write-up from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com, and he says 3 U.S. troops were wounded in a rocket attack in Syria on Wednesday that came after the U.S. launched airstrikes in the country. The rocket attacks targeted the U.S. base at Village Green at the Conoco gas fields, which are both located in eastern Syria. CENTCOM said one of the service members was treated for a minor wound, while 2 others are still under evaluation for mild injuries. The U.S. responded to the rocket attacks by launching strikes from Apache helicopters against the vehicles. CENTCOM said 2 or 3 suspected Iranian-backed militants were killed in the helicopter strikes. The airstrikes started around escalation announced by CENTCOM Tuesday nights and hit targets around Deir el-Zor, Syria. And Connor, this has again escalated with a third day of airstrikes. I don't have a write-up on that to go over, but just know that the fighting is continuing, and we will continue to update that on the show going forward. Now, one last story to cover before we wrap up here, Connor, that the UK is praising the Israeli, now I think probably a decade-long bombing campaign to Syria. You know, it's amazing when the US and people in the US get so upset over what Russia is doing in Ukraine. And somewhat, you know, there is some rightful, you know, people are upset for right reasons because, you know, Russia is invading Ukraine, which is you know, there's a lot of context and nuance and everything like that. But here we have a clear example of Israel just continuing to pummel the Syrian state, often killing civilians or just soldiers, you know, people who are fighting against ISIS, people who are fighting against jihadists in their own country regularly come under fire from Israel, and there's nothing essentially that Syria could do about it. And Israel the U.S. provides so much of that support. And so it was very interesting kind of to see a public green light from the UK on this, with having the UK special envoy to Syria praising Israel's bombing campaign. So, Connor, that's what we have on today's show. Thank you so much for coming back on. Sorry, everyone, we did have some tech issues. For anybody who was trying to listen, like right as we put out the show yesterday, Connor's audio didn't come through. So we'll make sure we have it right. We'll figure out what's going on, and more content for you next week. Thanks, Connor. Thanks, everyone.